Hello ladies and gentlemen, MarauderEX here with what I hope to be the first of many reviews for my channel. And I'm reviewing Hellenica, a game done by Dragonloft. It is a puzzle-like strategy RPG available on Steam. And I'm going to preface this review by saying, yes, this game was given to me by the developers for the purpose of creating content, but I'm not going to let that influence my opinion on the pros and cons of the game to the best of my abilities. I know there's always going to be a little bit of bias on that, whether or not you purchase the game yourself, but I'm going to try to let myself be as objective as possible, regardless of the fact that the game was provided to me. I'm also going to do a TLDR at the beginning of the review here, so that people who don't have the time to watch the entire review, because I can get a little long-winded when it comes to analyzing mechanics. I don't want the review to be completely bogged down by that, so I want everyone to have a base idea. And the TLDR is as follows. The game has a lot of potential. It also has a very, very steep learning curve, because it bills itself as a puzzle-like strategy RPG. The puzzle aspect is what you need to be able to master. There are mechanics in the game that don't follow your traditional strategy RPG, but they fit in the strategy RPG genre. But if you don't master those puzzle-like mechanics, combat can be exceptionally difficult and take considerably longer. But that aside, everything else about the game has a lot of pros to it that I think is an amazing effort from a small indie developer. So I'm actually very impressed by the work that Dragonloft has done, and I'm really kind of flabbergasted that they approached me for the project. So hopefully I don't rag on the game too much for them, because like I said, I see a lot of potential here. I really do. And it really brings back a ton of nostalgic feelings about playing strategy RPGs on the Saturn and the PS1. This game would feel right at home on those consoles. So it does a fantastic job of bringing that nostalgia. But like that nostalgia, it can either be balls to the wall hard or overly simplistic, depending on your grasp of the mechanics. So that's the TLDR of the review. I'm going to go in depth a little more on the gameplay mechanics, the combat, the story, music, graphics, etc. So let's get into the long-winded sections. The game is actually split into two sections. You have the combat and the story. I'm going to talk about the combat first. Combat is your traditional 3/4 overhead isometric view for a strategy RPG. You've got sprite-based characters on 3D backgrounds. The unique parts of combat is the turn order happens all at once for each side. So you take your turns for your characters, you take each character, give them a turn assignment. They all move into position at once, and then they attack characters or perform actions in sequence. So it all happens at once, but it all still happens in sequence. It's one of those things that you have to kind of see it to understand, and I'm going to have gameplay footage showing so that hopefully I can get all of this accurately portrayed. Combat in itself is not just solely strategy RPG combat on a grid-based system. Like I said, it does have a lot of puzzle mechanics. That puzzle mechanic specifically of what I've affectionately referred to as the secondary movement mechanics. The biggest mechanic for this game is the ability to knock people into or away from other things. So you can knock enemies off ledges and have them take fall damage. You can knock enemies into each other or other objects or terrain set pieces and have them take collision damage, or you can just move them out of the way. No damage intended. So that is the biggest mechanic to the game, is being able to not only master your terrain, but master your control of how the enemies interact with that terrain. So knocking people off of ledges or knocking people into the air or into other sections of the map is a huge part of this game, because it takes movement in a 3D RPG, strategy RPG, to a new level. Much like in Final Fantasy Tactics, where you had certain height requirements for where and how you could attack, you have that here, but then you also have the means of knocking people into or away from other height or terrain sections, adding a completely new layer of mastery to combat. And that mechanic itself is the puzzle mechanic that, if you can master, can make combat exceptionally easy, but if you don't master it, combat can be very difficult and very frustrating. Combat also has 3 objectives at the start of each battle. Those objectives allow you to gain XP, 2 of which are going to be told right from the start. The 3rd is going to be unlocked. Now, you can get the objective on your first playthrough if you happen to meet its requirements without having it unlocked first. So say one of the objectives is complete combat without taking any damage. If you manage to complete combat without taking any damage, you will get that as if you completed it. If you didn't, it will unlock saying, hey, this was the objective, you missed it. You can either restart combat, or you can play through the game again, which I will get through. I will talk about that in the how long it would take to complete section. So, combat in itself can be a little difficult. Progression is also a little difficult. You don't level up like you do in typical strategy RPGs. Each character does not have a set level or experience. It's all shared. At the end of combat, depending on the number of objectives you completed plus the combat itself, you get a set amount of XP, and once you reach the max, you level up. Once you level up, you get a point. That point is used to unlock abilities for characters. The only problem is that 1 point is shared between all of your available party members. So if you level up once, you get 1 point, but you have 4 characters, you will only be able to unlock 1 ability for 1 character. Which means progression does feel like it can be rather slow, because if you miss the 3rd objective, there's a good likelihood you will not level up simply from each combat round. So it could take 2 sections of combat to level up, which feels a little slow. It feels like you're not able to go into the next fight with any sort of noticeable upgrade. But again, combat is not 100% strategy RPG, so your abilities and level do not define the success. It's the ability to use those in conjunction with the secondary movement of knocking your enemies around, which that plays way more of a factor than just making sure you come in with, an overly grinded force with, a ton of abilities. But I will say it does make the progression of combat feel a little slow, because you can go several fights without getting more than 1 ability for a character. So, and since you are limited on the amount of abilities you can bring into combat, that in itself also makes leveling up characters feel a little slow, because say you pick the wrong ability and now you're kind of stuck with it until you level up and can get something else. So that in itself is combat. The rest of the game is told through the story sections, which are very, very reminiscent of Shining in the Darkness, where you are on a static image of the particular area you are in, with characters that you can point and click on and interact with in that way. Now, it can be very long-winded, and there are sections where they are going to be referencing a lot of Greek history and mythology. However, the game does provide you with a dictionary. Any terminology that is listed in red you can actually click on, and it will bring up a hint box giving you information about what they are talking about. So say, they want to talk about Socrates, and they mention the name Socrates. You click on Socrates as it's listed in red, and bring up, oh, Socrates was, a philosopher and, leader of politics at this time, that sort of thing. So while they're going to be making a ton of references, they also give you the means to say, okay, what are they referencing here? What do I feel like I'm not getting? So that in itself is actually really helpful because I studied a ton of Greek and Roman mythology, but there are still things listed here that I have not heard of, which, granted, my studies of that were years ago, and mostly not actually academic, so that in itself is actually helpful to have that reference guide. The rest of the story itself, combining the combat and the chat sections, are separated by days. And I've played about 2.5 hours and reached day 4, so it doesn't take terribly long to get through because there are 9 days listed. But while it doesn't take a long time to get in between particular days, one of the things that does stand out in terms of replayability is the fact that each day has multiple story paths that can be unlocked by talking to characters in certain orders. So say on day 1 you have 3 people to talk to one as the first character that you pick. We'll say character C. That will open up a story for day 2 on its own specific track, but it may mean you can now not talk to character A during that day, which character A would have given you a completely different story path. So character C brings up path C, but character A brings up path A. Talking to one or the other would cut the other out, only making path A or C available. So there's a lot of replayability because of that, because each time you take a different path, it is a completely different section of story and combat. Path A could have a battle in a city with conversations in said city, whereas Path C could have combat in a forest with conversations being held there. And Path A could have access to a specific battle NPC that you would only get for that battle, whereas Path C might not have any extra characters at all, or Path C could have a character that would join you permanently. So there's a lot of replayability because each time you go through, you have access to get a completely different section of the overall story. So while the game itself does take you through the story from beginning to end, there are different paths that allow a lot of different access. That in itself is just interesting for replayability alone. But then again, like I said, it doesn't take long to get there, but it gives you the ability to see different aspects. So, and again, I have not completely beaten the game, so I don't know if maybe that also provides different endings, or if there's a set ending and you just get to that ending taking various paths, taking the high road versus the low road, so to speak. So, next up, the controls. The controls are actually very well done, given the fact that it is a strategy RPG. Everything is controlled by the mouse. You have access to click on any character to see any information about that character. The ability to rotate is click. It's actually very well done. It's very, very simplistic style of point and click for a strategy RPG rather than having a set controller. In fact, I've not seen any settings for having a control pad rather than just a mouse. So with that said, if it were to be ported to consoles, there would have to add some sort of controller support, but it would also mean that this game could be playable on any touch device with relative ease, because you could just replace the touch device or the mouse point and click with the touch point and click. So I would love to see this on 3DS, smartphones, the upcoming Switch with its touchscreen. That there are a lot of potentials without having to completely add controller support. But I would also like to see controller support just for allowing, options. So the graphics are very much at home on the Saturn or PS1. It is an incredible mix of sprite-based graphics on 3D rendered terrain. There's not a huge level of detail, but the characters themselves are portrayed well enough to where you know who's who. The animations are very much at home on a 32-bit console. They're not super in-depth animations, like you're not going to get, thousands upon thousands of frames of animation. It's nowhere near something like the lines of Blaze Blue for sprite animations. Not anything like that, but it is a step above things like Final Fantasy Tactics in terms of actual character animations. So that is something that I know would be a turnoff to some people, but I personally think it has an amazing retro charm. But I also know that this day and age, it's very easy to say, well, if you're going to do sprite-based animations, you should do very, in-depth sprite-based animations, because it's a lost art. And, well, I agree it is a lost art. I also don't feel it needs to be ridiculously over the top, especially for a strategy RPG. But the graphic detail for the background and terrain is a little wonky, because you have set pieces like trees, barrels, that are also going to be sprite-based. Those are more interactable terrain, but you also have the solid set terrain of rocks and ground that the textures are very different between the two. It provides a unique art style and an artistic direction, but it is very much clashing elements. But I think it's not done in a negative clash. I think it's just you see it as very much a difference of, this is more foreground, this is more background, rather than these two things should not have been mixed together. The sound, I'm not really the best person to say about sound design. I'm not really that good. I'm borderline tone deaf. I will say there's not been a song that really drags me into the world, allows me to immerse myself in the world. For other games, there's always a song that either gets me pumped up for combat or makes me feel the overall mood of the situation. Final Fantasy Tactics, for example, has the song Trisection, which is just one of my favorite battle themes of all time, and hearing that on the battlefield always gets me prepared to have an epic fight. Even if it's against fodder enemies, I'm expecting an amazing fight. I've not heard that yet in Hellenica, but again, I'm not one to, dismantle or overanalyze music, because I again, borderline tone deaf. So, with that, that's really all I can say about the game. Like I said, there's a lot of potential for this game. I really hope this is not the only strategy RPG Dragonloft ever does, because I feel that they could take this and branch out more with, take other mythologies, Norse, Egyptian, put different spins on them, and then revamp the battle system a little bit. Like I said, the puzzle-like elements, I do like the added layer of strategy for the secondary movements of knocking people around and creating massive amounts of damage chains by, knocking them off like a huge cliff and just having them die instantly, or knocking them into things where they bounce off of enemies, doing chain damage to all of them, or knocking them up into the air, into different sections of the terrain, making it difficult for them to get back to me. There's a lot there, but I feel like that adds a little bit too much of a puzzle element rather than a strategic combat element. Because it feels like those abilities are only useful in a couple of situations, and if you don't use them in that particular situation, it's not quite as useful, and then you fall back on standard combat, which is not the fastest means to get through combat in this game at times. Especially with the level progression system feeling slower than most other strategy RPGs. So, like I said, I think there's a lot of potential. I really enjoy the concept of the game, the aspects, the graphic style, the artistic direction. The mechanics of the game are new and interesting. It's something different with a strategy RPG, which, you know, that's a genre that does not see a ton of overall refinement. So the fact that anyone is trying to add something new and exciting to a strategy RPG just instantly means I've got to look into that right off the bat. So I'm really impressed. I am. Like I said, there are a couple of things that, you know, they're design choices that I'm not particularly fond of, and I feel like the learning curve with the secondary mechanics is a little high at times, but I'm also comparing that to a static strategy RPG, not a puzzle-like strategy RPG. So there's a little bit of give and take there. But I see the potential for the game. So, the game is Hellenica. It is available on Steam. Go check it out. The developers are Dragonloft. Go give them, you know, whatever support you can, even if it's just, you know, tweeting out the game, because I really feel like you can see that they poured a lot of effort into this title, and being a small developer, and, you know, as someone who wants to get into game design myself, I understand how difficult it can be, you know, just spreading the word. So, as I said, the game has its pros and cons. I like it. I highly recommend it, but also I highly recommend learning the system so that you can take advantage of all of the mechanics the game has to offer, before just jumping right in and treating this as another Final Fantasy Tactics, Shining Force style strategy RPG where combat is combat, because that is not the case, and that is a good way to get a little more frustrated with the game than most other strategy RPGs. So, like I said, check it out. I will have links to the developers page and Steam page in the video description. I hope you've enjoyed this review. If you want to see more reviews like this in the future, let me know. If there's anything that I can do to provide a little bit more streamlined review, like I said, I do get a little long-winded with some of the analysis, please let me know, because if there's a better way I can review these games while still providing, you know, valuable information as to the pros and cons of the game, I'd love to hear it. So, till then, later everyone.